CCP is repeating some of the same mistakes that the Soviet Union made, alienating potential allies, breaking trust at home and abroad, rejecting property rights and predictable rule of law. I have faith. I have faith because of the awakening I see among other nations that know we can't go back to the past in the same way that we do here in America. I've heard this from Brussels to Sydney to Hanoi. And most of all, I have faith we can defend freedom because of the sweet appeal of freedom itself. Look at the Hong Kongers clamoring to emigrate abroad as the CCP tightens its grip on that proud city. They wave American flags. It's true. There are differences. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is deeply integrated into the global economy. But Beijing is more dependent on us than we are on them. Look, I reject the notion that we're living in an age of inevitability, that some trap is preordained, that CCP supremacy is the future. Our approach isn't destined to fail because America is in decline. As I said in Munich earlier this year, the free world is still winning. We just need to believe it and know it and be proud of it. People from all over the world still want to come to open societies. They come here to study. They come here to work. They come here to build a life for their families. They're not desperate to settle in China. It's time. It's great to be here today. The timing is perfect. It's time for free nations to act. Not every nation will approach China in the same way, nor should they. Every nation will have to come to its own understanding of how to protect its own sovereignty, how to protect its own economic prosperity, and how to protect its ideals from the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party. But I call on every leader of every nation to start by doing what America has done, to simply insist on reciprocity, to insist on transparency and accountability from the Chinese Communist Party. It's a cadre of rulers that are far from homogenous, and these simple and powerful standards will achieve a great deal. For too long, we let the CCP set the terms of engagement, but no longer. Free nations must set the tone. We must operate on the same principles. We have to draw common lines in the sand that cannot be washed away by the CCP's bargains or their blandishments. Indeed, this is what the United States did recently when we rejected China's unlawful claims in the South China Sea once and for all, as we have urged countries to become clean countries so that their citizens' private information doesn't end up in the hand of the Chinese Communist Party. We did it by setting standards. Now, it's true, it's difficult. It's difficult for some small countries. They fear being picked off. Some of them, for that reason, simply don't have the ability or the courage to stand with us for the moment. Indeed, we have a NATO ally of ours that hasn't stood up in the way that it needs to with respect to Hong Kong because they fear Beijing will restrict access to China's market. This is the kind of timidity that will lead to historic failure, and we can't repeat it. We cannot repeat the mistakes of these past years. The challenge of China demands exertion, energy from democracies, those in Europe, those in Africa, those in South America, and especially those in the Indo-Pacific region. And if we don't act now, ultimately, the CCP will erode our freedoms and subvert the rules-based order that our societies have worked so hard to build. If we bend the knee now, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party, whose actions are the primary challenge today in the free world. General Secretary Xi is not destined to tyrannize inside and outside of China forever unless we allow it. Now, this isn't about containment. Don't buy that. It's about a complex new challenge that we've never faced before. The USSR was closed off from the free world. Communist China is already within our borders. So we can't face this challenge alone. The United Nations, NATO, the G7 countries, the G20, our combined economic, diplomatic, and military power is surely enough to meet this challenge if we direct it clearly and with great courage. Maybe it's time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies. We have the tools. I know we can do it. Now we need the will. To quote scripture, I ask, is our spirit willing but our flesh weak. If the free world doesn't change, communist China will surely change us. There can't be a return to the past practices because they're comfortable or because they're convenient. Securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time, and America is perfectly positioned to lead it because our founding principles give us that opportunity. As I explained in Philadelphia last week, staring at Independence Hall, our nation was founded on the premise that all human beings possess certain rights that are unalienable, and it's our government's job to secure those rights. It is a simple and powerful truth. It's made us a beacon of freedom for people all around the world, including people inside of China. Indeed, Richard Nixon was right when he wrote in 1967 that the world cannot be safe until China changes. Now it's up to us to heed his words. Today, the danger is clear, and today the awakening is happening. Today, the free world must respond. We can never go back to the past. May God bless each of you. May God bless the Chinese people, and may God bless the people of the United States of America. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Please be seated. I'm Hugh Hewitt, the president of the library, and Secretary Pompeo graciously invited some questions as I was listening. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Secretary, at the Nixon Library. My first question has to do with the context of the president's visit in 1972. You mentioned the Soviet Union was isolated, but it was dangerous. He went to the People's Republic of China in 1972 to try and ally and combine interest with them against the Soviet Union. It was successful. Does Russia present an opportunity now to the United States to coax them into the battle to be relentlessly candid about the Chinese Communist Party?
So I do think there's that opportunity. That opportunity is born of the relationship, the natural relationship between Russia and China. And we can do something as well. There are places where we need to work with Russia. Today, or tomorrow, I guess it is, our teams will be on the ground with the Russians working on a strategic dialogue to hopefully create the next generation of arms control agreements like Reagan did. It's in our interest, it's in Russia's interest. We've asked the Chinese to participate. They've declined to date. We hope they'll change their mind. It's these kind of things, these proliferation issues, these big strategic challenges that if we work alongside Russia, I'm convinced we can make the world safer. And so I think there is a place for us to work with the Russians to achieve a more likely outcome of peace, not only for the United States, but for the world.
President Nixon also put quite a lot of story in personal relationships over many years with individuals. That can lead wrong. President Bush famously misjudged Vladimir Putin and said so afterwards. You have met President Xi often. Is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party someone with whom we can deal on a transparent and reliable basis, in your opinion, based on your personal diplomacy with him?
So the meetings that I've had and the meeting that the president we've had, they've been good, frank conversations. He is the most powerful leader of China since Mao. He has also, in many ways, deinstitutionalized the Chinese Communist Party, thus giving him even more capacity and more power. But Hugh, I think the way to think about it is how I spoke about this today. It's about actions. And so how one evaluates one's counterparts sitting across the table from them is important to think about how you can find common understandings and make progress. But in the end, it's not about what someone says or the agreement that they sign, but are they prepared to lead, to do the things that they committed to? Are they prepared to fulfill their promises? And we've watched this China walk away for their promises to the world on Hong Kong. We walked their General Secretary Xi promised President Obama in the Rose Garden in 2015 that he wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. Google the South China Sea and arms. You'll see another promise broken. So in the end, from my perspective, it's much more important to watch how leaders behave and how they lead than what it is you think when you have a chance to talk to them on the phone or meet them in person.
Mr. Secretary, you said this is not containment. I heard that very clearly. I have read the 3 previous speeches by Ambassador O'Brien, Director Wray, Attorney General Barr, and now listened to you very closely. It isn't containment, but it is a fairly comprehensive, multidimensional, relentlessly objective candor. Is that dangerous in a world that's not used to speaking clearly about delicate subjects?
You know, my experience, and I think President Trump's experience too in his life as a businessman, is the best policy is always true candor. Identifying the places that you have a red line, identifying places that you have a real interest, making clear if there's places where you don't and there's things that you can work on alongside each other. I think the real danger comes from misunderstandings and miscommunication and the failure to be honest about the things that matter to you, because others will move into that space and then conflict arises. I think the world is a heck of a lot safer when you have leaders who are prepared to be honest about the things that matter and prepared to talk about the things their nation is prepared to do to secure those interests. And you can reduce risk by these conversations so long as you're honest about it. So I don't think it's dangerous. I think it's just the opposite of that.
You also said, and I'm sure the speech will be known as the distrust but verify speech. When you distrust but verify, that still premises verification is possible. It is still possible to do agreements and to verify them, correct?
It is. Yeah, you can still do it. Each nation's got to be prepared for a certain amount of intrusiveness connected to that. And it is not in the nature of communist regimes to allow transparency inside of their country. And so it's been done before. We had arms controls agreements with the Soviet Union that we got verification that was sufficient to ensure that we protected American interests. I believe we can do it again. I hope that we can do this on these. The Chinese Communist Party has several hundred nuclear warheads. This is a serious global power. And to the extent we can find common ground, a common set of understandings to reduce risk that there's ever a really bad day for the world, we ought to do it, and it's going to require agreement and verification.
Ambassador Richard Haass, who is now chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, said very recently, it may have been yesterday, it might have been this morning, I saw it this morning preparing, quote, Secretary Pompeo doesn't speak of China, but of the Chinese Communist Party if there is a China, as if there were a China apart from the party. This is meant to antagonize and make diplomacy impossible, quite a stance for America's chief diplomat to take unless his goal is to ensure diplomacy fails. Is that your goal?
Goodness. Where to begin? Here's where I'll begin. It's a bit patronizing to the people of China to make such an assertion that they are not free thinking beings, that they're not rational people who were given they too were made in the image of God, right? They have all the capacity that anybody in the world does. So to somehow think that we ought to ignore the voices of the people of China seems to me the wrong approach. It is true. The Chinese Communist Party is a one-party rule state. And so we will deal with the Chinese Communist Party as the head of state for China. And we need to engage in dialogue. But it seems to me we would dishonor ourselves and the people of China if we ignored them.
Now, Ambassador O'Brien, whose speech you referenced, put heavy emphasis on the ideology of Marxist-Leninism. It was almost quaint to hear that conversation again. It's gone from our vocabulary. Does the American people, and especially the American media, need to reacquaint itself with what Marxist-Leninists believe because the CCP genuinely does believe it?
You know, I always get in trouble, Hugh, when I comment on the media. So I'll say this much. For those of us who have lived and seen and observed, there are other Marxist-Leninist nations today as well, and have seen, they believe, they have an understanding, a central understanding of how people interact and how societies ought to interact. And it is certainly the case today that the leadership in China believes that. We should acknowledge that, and we should make sure that we don't for a moment think that they don't believe it. That's what Ambassador O'Brien's speech was about. It was the fact it was acknowledging that they believe it and recognizing that we have to respond in a way that reflects our understanding of the way they view the world.
Let's not talk about the American media. I want to talk about the Chinese media for a moment. They are aggressive, to say the least. And right now they are aggressively defending, for example, TikTok. A small question within a large question. Is TikTok capable of being weaponized? Is that an example of what's going on? And generally, Chinese media has become far more aggressive than I've seen in 30 years since I was at the library the first time of watching it. Is that something you've noticed as well?
Yes, they're very aggressive. Two pieces to this. One you hit upon. One is I'll describe as their technology media. Without singling out any particular business, our view of these companies is we're neither for or against the company. We're about making sure that we protect the information that belongs to each of you, your health records, your face, if it's a facial recognition software, your address, all the things that you carry that you want to make sure the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have. We have a responsibility to make sure that the systems that you're using don't give them access to that. And so whether it's the efforts we made against Huawei or the work that we're doing on other software firms, the American task is to protect the American people and their information. Second piece of this has to do with their what I'll call the state-sponsored media of China and their disinformation. You should know, and this is where I am concerned about the American media too. These are state-sponsored media organizations that take their messaging from the Chinese Communist Party each day. When American institutions pick up those storylines and carry them forward, they are in fact propagating Chinese propaganda, and we all ought to be wise to that. There was an editorial in the New York Times yesterday by someone who had a clear view that was antithetical to the American way of life. The New York Times ran it straight up without comment, forwarding, although albeit in the opinion section, but propagating Chinese propaganda. That is certainly not instructive when they're telling senators from Arkansas they can't simply talk about American freedom in that same media outlet.
You mentioned that a lot of corporate America, and you mentioned specifically Hollywood, have got deep intertwinement with the Chinese economy. So I don't want to talk about soft power, I want to talk about soft appeasement. One of my favorite sports figures, LeBron James, falls silent when China comes up. In the new Top Gun movie, the Taiwan and Japanese patches are taken off Maverick's jacket. They're not going to be in Top Gun 2, they were in Top Gun 1. What do you say, not to those individuals, but to everyone who has an American spotlight about their responsibility to be candid about the People's Republic of China?
Here's our ask. Our ask is, if you claim that you care about human rights or your social justice or these things, if you make that part of your corporate theology, then you ought to be consistent. And you can't be consistent if you're operating there in China without talking about and acknowledging what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in certain parts of their country, the oppression that's taking place. Look, every business leader has got to make decisions for themselves. They've got to be able to live with the decisions that they make. You highlighted a few. I'd simply ask this. If you run an entity and the United States government were to tell you you couldn't do something, put a particular symbol in your movie or put a particular name on your menu, if we were to tell you that, you'd say, nope, that's not appropriate, and it, of course, would not be appropriate. It seems to me that if you permit the Chinese Communist Party to limit you in that way, it's got to be difficult for you to go home at night.
Two more questions, Mr. Secretary. Because it is hot and it is warm, and everyone out here has been in the sun for a while. You're a West Point graduate, and as Governor Wilson noted, #1, so this might be tough for you, but we are like Athens was a naval power, America is a naval power, and as like Sparta is, China is a land power. Do we not have to change how we approach defense spending to put more emphasis on our naval resources than on our Army resources?
Oh, that's tough for an Army guy to say.
I know.
That's just, you're killing me. Look, I'll leave to Secretary Esper the details of this, but here's what I can say. When President Trump set out our national security strategy early on in the administration, for the first time, we identified China in a way that was fundamentally different than we had done, this isn't partisan, for decades. That was important because that was a signal to all of us, whether it's the State Department or the Defense Department, that we need to reorient our assets. And so, yes, you've seen the Department of Defense to begin to do that. These are big things to turn. These budgets are multi-year. It takes a while. But if you look at how Secretary Esper and President Trump are positioning our military capabilities, not just the tactical, operational, and strategic capabilities, but our cyber capabilities, our space capabilities. If you look at how we're thinking about this and spending resources in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think you'll see that our focus has shifted pretty dramatically. It's not to say that our efforts to protect America from terrorism are behind us. We still have work to do there. But I think this great power challenge that presents itself is something that we have recognized, and we begin to make sure that we allocate your money, our taxpayer resources that we have to the appropriate ends to achieve American security.
My last question has to do with the former Secretary of State who was also an Army man, George Marshall. He gave a speech in 1947 at your alma mater, Harvard, in which he called on all the nations of the world to recognize that the world was in crisis and to choose a side. And he assured them in that famous address that if you chose the American side in asserting Europe, you could count on America. So as you make the appeal you did today, not just to Europe, where it's relatively easy to be outspoken, though Norway has found it not to be outspoken, but to Taiwan and Japan and Vietnam and all of the Australia, all of the nations of that region, can they rely on America in the way that people opposing the Soviet Union could rely on George Marshall's assurance in 1947?
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly, Hugh. The only thing I'll say is this language of pick a side does make sense to me, but I think about picking a side differently than picking America or picking China. I think the sides, the division, the shirts and skins, if you will, is between freedom and tyranny. I think that's the decision that we're asking each of these nations to make. And here's the good news of this. The good news is it does take American leadership often in these cases. To your point, they need to know that America will be there for them. I've seen the tide turn. In just these 3.5 years of our administration, I've watched other nations have less timidity, become more prepared to stand up for their freedoms and for the freedoms of their people. We don't ask them to do this for America. We ask them to do it for their country and for their nation, the freedom and the independence, and to protect the rights of their people. And when we do that and we tell them that America will be there, I'm very confident in the end that this is a world that, with the hard work applied, will become one that is governed by a rules-based order, and the freedom of the American people will be secured.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the Secretary.
Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this historic address with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We'd like to invite you to relax, refresh, and cool off in the First Lady's Rose Garden and under the eaves of the colonnade. Please follow the ladies in red jackets. They will show you the way. Thank you.